Hi there. Some old guy in Wisconsin. I'm talking today about the 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. This is Saturday, November 22nd, and the information that I have is the latest that I could find. One of the problems that I've seen occur is that the full peace plan is not something that is talked about a whole lot. There are bits and pieces, of course, out there. There's an awful lot of analysis done, particularly by talking heads who aren't Ukrainian. And I would very much like to hear more from the ground in Ukraine, but that's just not something that we hear a whole lot about. The entirety of the 28-point peace plan is out there to see it. And although it is being presented as a serious document offered by the United States, it is anything but. So today I want to talk with you about this so-called peace plan. So the full plan begins with point number 1, is that Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Now, for a moment, I want to just stop at the breathtaking absurdity of that point. No one who is not an invader of Ukraine or a wholehearted supporter of Russia, no one is questioning whether the country of Ukraine is sovereign. It is a sovereign nation, and that's just that. It's recognized by almost everyone in the world who's not actively invading the country or who is not supportive of that country. And the idea that part of the peace plan is to confirm the sovereignty, we might as well enter into treaties where people say the United States is going to be confirmed in its sovereignty. It's insulting. It is a deal breaker right there on step number 1. But that's what point number 1 is. Point number 2 reads, a comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. Notice what that is. That's supposedly now is supposed to be an agreement for non-aggression has to be concluded between these 3 parties, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. Russia is the invader here. And they were the ones who guaranteed Ukraine's security when Ukraine, decades ago, decided to give up their nuclear missiles, the ones that they got after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Ukraine broke those up. They gave those missiles up in exchange for security guarantees from international agreements that included the United States and Russia. Both of them agreed to provide security for Ukraine going forward, since Ukraine was surrendering their own defensive materials. That agreement, of course, was trashed. It was not kept. And to now claim that they are supposed to trust Russia at all, and you notice the United States is not mentioned in that. They're supposed to trust that these other parties are going to guarantee that they're going to be non-aggressive in the future. That's just absurd. Why would Ukraine trust Russia in any way to keep to an agreement? The other statement in that point too, all ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. No negotiation, no seeking of justice and compensation for past atrocities that are still currently happening. We're just going to assume that this is it. We're going to level the playing field. We're going to set the 0 bar right here. And that is just absurd. That is asking Ukraine and Europe to simply throw their hands up and go, oh, well, it's all cool from here. And that benefits no one but Russia. Point number 3. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. So first, it's expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries. That's been part of the international rule-based order since the end of the Second World War. And the idea that we need to just simply remind Russia that it needs to not do that anymore is also absurd. They need to get the hell back across the line. They need to get off of the Crimean Peninsula, which they took illegally in 2014. But this second provision that NATO will not expand further, that's a gimme to Russia as well, because Russia doesn't want NATO any closer to its borders than it already is. Tough shit. Russia doesn't get a say in what NATO does. And the idea that the United States is going to take NATO and throw it under the bus not only demonstrates that the United States, the current regime in Washington, the Trump administration, is thoroughly in the pocket of the despot Putin, but also that the United States is distancing itself from NATO, an organization that it was largely responsible for the creation of way back at the end of the Second World War. Point number 4. A dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, to resolve all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation in order to ensure global security and increase opportunities for cooperation and future economic development. 1. The North American Treaty Organization, NATO, is not an economic bloc, and the idea that you're going to tie economic opportunities to any agreement where NATO is concerned is ridiculous. It is a military organization. Technically, it's been described as a military standards organization, NATO is, which is true. But the idea that a dialogue between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, is just more indication that the U.S. is considering itself as not part of NATO anymore. And that's also ridiculous. We didn't withdraw from NATO, and we're not going to unless Congress decides that we're going to. Point number 5. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. These guarantees are part of a separate document in terms of these guarantees. And again, the U.S. and its NATO allies is supposed to be treating Ukraine under a variation of the NATO Article 5, which is an attack on one, is an attack against all. But in this case, the separate document indicates that the attack is to be considered an attack against the entire transatlantic community. So it's yet another way for the United States to say, we're not actually part of that. We're part of the group, we're transatlantic community, but we're not part of NATO. And that's, again, is ridiculous. Point number 6 is a limitation of the size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. This is a reduction in size, obviously. And this also goes hand in hand with Russian desires to limit Ukraine's ability to defend itself, which is, again, absurd. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It gets to decide how big its military is going to be, and Russia, nor the United States, nor NATO has a damn thing to say about it. By the way, Ukraine's current military is 800 to 850,000 personnel, and it had been around 250,000 before the war, but that's according to a Ukrainian official, so those are numbers that I'm taking on at face value. The fact that the military was significantly smaller than the limitation that's being offered here is not, is not some kind of a gimme to Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to make its military any damn size it wants. And the limitation to 600,000 personnel would be a 200 to 250,000 person reduction in arms force over their current. And that is exactly what Russia wants. Point 7, Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. That is, again, a Russian talking point right there. They don't want Ukraine, they don't want anybody else into NATO if they can avoid it. They would love to see NATO just freaking disappear, but it's not going to. The idea that this agreement permanently forbids Ukraine from seeking membership in NATO and forbids NATO at the same time from accepting Ukraine into its numbers is just handing Russia what it wants. We are looking at Russia, and they wrote this. Russia was largely responsible for this 28-point peace plan. This is something that they've wanted for a while, is to prevent NATO from getting any closer to Russian borders. And they don't want NATO to respond under Article 5 in the event that they decide to attack more of Ukraine in the future. And this is, again, it's just absurd. Point number 9 is, point 8, NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. Right now, the UK and France are talking about putting small numbers of forces in Ukraine, but that's not even acknowledged. That work is not being acknowledged by this peace plan at all. This peace plan wants to remove that as a possibility. Point number 9 is that European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. They already are. Poland has an extremely sizable military. Their addition of F-35 jets is something that is ongoing. They've also recently agreed to take on a number of Golden Eagle fighters out of South Korea. I can't remember the exact designation of that jet, but they've bought a considerable amount of military hardware from the South Korean manufacturing capability. They are definitely a supplier of military equipment, vehicles and otherwise, somebody to watch in the future. But that's Poland. They are modernizing their military capabilities. Number 10, the U.S. guarantee. Now this one is particularly insulting. The U.S. will receive compensation for its guarantee. Yeah, the U.S. is writing into this 28-point peace plan is that Ukraine will have to pay us in order to provide them a security guarantee. If Ukraine invades Russia, it loses the guarantee. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated, recognition of the new territory and other benefits of this deal will be revoked. We'll come back to that, the recognition of the new territory. And if Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. Now, this entire point 10, again, is insulting. This is protection racket. This is literally a mob boss in the White House trying to exert a further grift on people who are fighting to defend themselves against an aggressor and to retake their homeland, which is being stolen away from them under force of arms. The idea that the U.S. would not rise up to defend such people against an aggressor, that's ridiculous. We should already be doing that. And yes, I'm well aware that we should have been doing that in places other than the Ukraine, but we're not talking about that right now. Right at the present time, we're talking about this. Point number 11 is that Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will receive short-term preferential access to European market while this issue is being considered. Why the United States thinks that it can stick its fingers into this particular pie, I don't know. What Ukraine does with or into the EU is none of our damn business. And the arrogance that the United States is displaying here is embarrassing to us and insulting to Ukraine. Point number 12, a powerful global package of measures to rebuild Ukraine, which would be included but not limited to the creation of a Ukraine Development Fund to invest in fast-growing industries, including tech, data centers, and AI. There's AI again. Everybody seems to think that you've got to cram AI into everything. The United States will cooperate with Ukraine to jointly rebuild, develop, modernize, and operate Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. This is part of the civilian infrastructure that Russia has repeatedly destroyed in an effort, usually, by the way, on the approach of winter, in an effort to make the civilians suffer as much as possible. We're not striking military targets. We're just calling them military targets, even though the victims are people who are not military targets at all. That's Russia for you. Joint efforts to rehabilitate war-affected areas for the restoration, reconstruction, and modernization of cities and residential areas. Again, none of this would be necessary if Russia was not hailing missiles and drones on top of civilian areas. Infrastructure development. And then the big one, extraction of minerals and natural resources I think we see where that's going, right? That's certainly something that the United States wants to get its hooks into. The World Bank will develop a special financing package to accelerate these efforts. The World Bank is not your friend. And the fact that the World Bank wants to get involved in this is just more evidence of the international oligarchs that would like to make a profit off of everybody as much as possible while giving up as little as possible in return. This particular point with the development of financial structures is a good idea, but in my opinion, this needs to be extracted from Russia in terms of international reparations because of their aggression against a foreign neighbor. Point number 13, Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon in stages, and the United States will enter into a long-term economic cooperation agreement for the mutual development in areas of energy, and there's a whole laundry list of things. And Russia will be invited to rejoin the G8. That is nothing more than a gimme to Russia. This is basically saying, we'll just let you off. There's no repercussions for the actions that you've undertaken. No justice to be sought for the invasion of another country. And that is just absurd. Frozen funds is point number 14. Frozen funds will be used. $100 billion of it will be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. Again, that's the United States trying to do stuff with other people's money. Which is funny because that's what they always describe socialism as. And that is something that we recently passed a resolution decrying the horrors of. The U.S. will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. So not only are we going to use frozen Russian assets to do these rebuilding in Ukraine, but the United States is going to get half of any profits to come out of that. Bad enough that we're insisting that they pay us a protection fee, but now we want to take half their profits in the same stroke. Point number 15, a joint American-Russian working group on security issues will be established, which we should have been doing already. We should be talking to each other about what it is that we're doing, what we will allow. There's a lot of uncertainty going on in the world, and the last thing that we want is a degraded world power, which is what Russia is, to be rolling around like a loose cannon. They need to be bolted down to the deck hard. Point 16, Russia will enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine. The international rules-based order already establishes that. And the fact that Russia has been perfectly willing to violate that in pursuit of territory to which it has no right would kind of argue that if they enshrine this in their own law, they're just going to ignore that too. On top of that, they can enshrine it in law and then unenshrine it in the next breath. So that's a useless point. Point 17, the United States and Russia will agree to extend the validity of treaties on the non-proliferation and control of nuclear weapons, including START 1. Separate issue, really, has not a damn thing to do with what's going on in Ukraine, so that being thrown in there is really nothing. It doesn't have any real point to this. Point 18, Ukraine agrees to be a non-nuclear state. They're already a non-nuclear state. They surrendered their nuclear weapons in exchange for international guarantees for their own security, guarantees which have been flagrantly violated by Russia and not supported by the United States. Why Ukraine would trust any of us on this now, I have no idea. They shouldn't. That would be my suggestion. Point 19, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be launched under the supervision of the IAEA, and electricity produced will be evenly distributed between Russia and the Ukraine 50-50. Again, what would Ukraine stand to benefit at all from sending 50% of power generated in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant over to the people who just invaded them? Screw Russia. If they want power, they can either buy it or they can make it themselves. Point number 20, both countries undertake to implement educational programs in schools and societies aimed at promoting understanding and tolerance of different cultures and eliminating racism and prejudice. For the United States, which is currently operating under a system of systemic racism that goes all the way back to the founding of our country and has a admittedly bigoted and racist administration operating in the White House, for them to insist that Russia and Ukraine implement a re-education program of their citizenry in order to eliminate things that we will not do? That's pretty rich. Oh, all Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. This on the heels, just this week, where the Coast Guard announced that they had downgraded the swastika from a hate symbol to a potentially divisive symbol, and then turned around and put it back up as a hate symbol after the blast of disapproval that came against them by members of Congress as well as members of the public. And for us to now say that they need to somehow say that Nazi ideology is no good, well, how about United States? How about you deal with your own shit first? Point number 21. Here is where it all goes Russia's way. Territories, right? Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. That's territory that was either taken by Russia in military exercises or hasn't been taken by Russia at all. And we are expecting Ukraine to just give that up, and those are Russia's now, and that's it. If I were Ukraine, that point alone would cause me to take this piece of paper, shove it into the face of the American diplomat who was unfortunate enough to bring it here, and tell them to get the fuck out of my face. Kherson and Zaporizhzhia will be frozen along the line of contact, which will mean de facto recognition along the line of contact. So right now there's fighting going on in that area. Part of that territory is owned by is owned by Ukraine, but under the control of Russia. So now what they're basically saying is right along that line, that's the new border. Russia will relinquish other agreed territories it controls outside the 5 regions that it doesn't care about. I mean, let's put it this way. Russia needs to get the hell back across the border and get off of Ukrainian soil. That's it. There's no negotiation on that point. Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as belonging to the Russian Federation. Russian forces will not enter. So you're going to say it belongs to Russia, but Russia's not going. We promise, pinky swear that we're not going to go in there. Nobody trusts Russia on that. And on top of that, that territory belongs to Ukraine. That's it. Point 22 is after agreeing on future territorial arrangements, both the Russian Federation and the Ukraine undertake not to change these arrangements by force. Oh, we're going to trust Russia not to just invade again because they don't like how things are going. How'd that work last time? Point 23. Russia will not prevent Ukraine from using the Dnieper River for commercial activities, and agreements will be reached on the free transport of grain across the Black Sea, which Ukraine has been able to do all along. So Russia now trying to press its authority in preventing Ukraine from moving its grain to the rest of the world. Significant numbers of other countries rely on that grain being freely available, and we want to give Russia control of the waterways that allow that to be shipped out. Again, absurd. Russia does not have any call to control the Black Sea or the river in that way. Point number 24. A humanitarian committee will be established to resolve outstanding issues. All remaining prisoners and bodies will be exchanged. All civilian detainees and hostages will be returned, including children. For a moment, let's remember that the Russians stole Ukrainian children and gave them to Russian parents. Just gave it away. A family reunification program will be implemented. We should be forcing that at gunpoint. Measures taken to alleviate the suffering of the victims of the conflict. Like we care. Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Not your goddamn call. I understand what they're trying to do now is they're trying to get an election going so that they can get rid of Zelensky. That's what they want to do. And if that is allowed to happen, they're allowed to force elections to occur within 100 days of the peace plan going into play, they will flood the area with propaganda like you would not damn believe. Point number 26. Here's a great one. All parties involved will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. We are going to let Russia get by with war crimes. That right there is a get out of jail free card for Russia. And point 27, this agreement will be legally binding, its implementation monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council headed by President Donald J. Trump. Sanctions imposed for violations. Now, notice that he's literally putting himself by name at the top of this commission. So what is the intent if Trump dies before he stops being president? What's going to happen after he's no longer president? The implication of that is that the only person that's ever going to be sitting in that chair is Donald Trump because he expects to be president for a while. And that isn't happening. His last term ends in 29. So he needs to be out of the chair. Point number 28 is once all parties agree to this memorandum, the ceasefire will take effect immediately. Both sides retreat to agreed points to begin the implementation. So there's all the 28 points. And this is nothing more than a gift to Vladimir Putin. It is utterly ridiculous that Ukraine would even consider this. And a speech that was given by Volodymyr Zelensky to his people yesterday indicated that Ukraine has a hard choice sitting in front of it. It can either sacrifice its dignity and accept this, or it can sacrifice its relationship with one of its best allies in this whole fight, which has been the United States. As an American, I can flat tell you that if I was ever in a situation where we had a foreign power invading part of our country, had taken part of it by force of arms, and someone came to me 3 years or 4 years in, or however many years in, with this kind of a peace plan, with this, I'm not certain that I wouldn't pull a "this is Sparta" moment and shoot the messenger right where he stood. We would not accept this. Death first. And the idea that the Ukrainians are somehow lesser than we are in the devotion to their own freedom, to their people, to their country, is arrogant, absurd, insulting, and dead wrong. You might notice I'm wearing a hat with a trizab on it. This, the Ukrainian symbol. There's a reason I am not wearing a hat with an American flag on it. Right now, the fight, the forefront of democracy is happening in Ukraine. And they are fighting against an aggressor who is pushing forward authoritarian ideologies, a despot named Putin. And I support Ukraine 100%. I support them in saying no to this entire thing. Russia doesn't expect them to say yes. Putin yesterday commented about this 28-point peace plan, but didn't talk very much about it, and made it very clear that he thinks that the reason why that we haven't seen more of this from the Ukrainians is because, and from the United States, is because Trump doesn't know that he can get the Ukrainians to agree to these points. On that, Putin and I agree. Zelensky needs to say no. The United States is not bargaining in good faith. We are meddling in things that we do not belong in, and we are making demands upon the Ukrainians that we would never accept being offered or imposed upon us by anyone else. What needs to happen right now is that the European Union needs to step up and be ready to go. And that includes also the international community everywhere else. They need to step up and be ready to go to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And if that means going without the United States help, do that. I can only assure the Ukrainians, and I can assure the rest of the international community, that those of us in the United States are working very hard to see to it that Donald Trump and his supporters have their hands removed from the reins of power. Our work continues on to educate the people of the United States and to uncover the morass of corruption that is at the heart of this administration, such that beginning in 2026, that we manage to take Congress back from the Republican Party and begin to hold the administration accountable for its excesses. And 2 years later, to put a Democrat into the White House with the intent of fixing our system so that it cannot be suborned in the way that has been done by the Trump administration and the MAGA movement, and hopefully be able to do what Joe Biden did during the brief period of time that he was president and bring us back into sync with the international community, bring us back with our own history, to be able to be seen as a defender of justice, of democracy, and freedom again, as we should have been all along. To the Ukrainians, Slava Ukraini, and we support you.